The Center for Educational Media and the College of Education at Middle Tennessee State University are proud to offer professional development to K-12 educators in Tennessee through our online video library. These videos are aligned with standards set by the Tennessee Department of Education. For more professional development videos, check out our website at cem.mtsu.edu.
Okay, well, welcome to our next installment of the collaborative we are going on between the Middle Tennessee Writing Project, the Center for Educational Media, and the English 4500 Teaching English Methods class. Today we have as our speaker Sarah Esberger from Central Magnet School, and her presentation is entitled Teaching Grammar Without Lots of Drills and Handouts.
All right, thanks guys for having me. So like Dr. Kate said, I'm Sarah Esberger. I work at Central Magnet School, just right down the road. I think you guys already know a little bit about our population, but students have to be accepted into our school, so they tend to be high achieving students. I teach English 2 Advanced Honors as well as AP English Language, and I also run the Writing Center at Central Magnet. So that gives you a little bit of background, and stuff I'm going to talk to you about is stuff that I mostly use in my sophomore class, but a little bit of it I use in my AP class as well. I'm a writing project person, so I wanted to start with writing into the day. So I want you to take a few minutes to answer one of these questions. What do I want grammar instruction to look like in my classroom? Or what are my goals for grammar instruction? Or do I think grammar instruction is important? Why or why not? And while you write, I'm also going to write. That's something that I do in my classroom. So when I have writing into the days or other assignments like this, small writing assignments that my students are doing in class, I try to write with them. So I'll be writing with you while you all write. All right, so let's, I think the first two questions kind of go together. So actually I want to skip ahead to that third question is, did any of you think about like grammar instruction? Like, do you feel like that's an important component of your language arts classroom? Yeah.
I think it is because grammar is basically like the basis of how we express ourselves. And through teaching proper grammar, you can teach people how to say what they mean and mean what they say.
That's wonderful, thank you. So we have a goal for our students that kind of taps into some of these other questions, that we want them to be able to express themselves, that our goal is communication, and grammar is kind of the building block for that. So if they don't have that building block, how are they going to be able to express themselves in multiple situations, right? We want our students to understand that there are different kinds of audiences, and so grammar is kind of a tool that they can use to be able to reach those different audiences. What about like what your goals are for your students? What do you want them to get out of your grammar instruction, or how do you envision it looking when you think about yourself in the classroom and how you might teach grammar to your students? Yes.
That's a question I think about a lot because I want to work with English language learners. And so I kind of cheated when I answered this question because I think that grammar instruction is going to be very important in my classroom. But I would like to make it not a lot of drills. And I think that I have a lot of enthusiasm for grammar, and I would like to make that work somehow.
Great. How many of you love grammar, kind of grammar nerds? Okay. All right. So there are a few of you. How many of you that's actually what you're dreading most about teaching English? Yeah, so we tend to fall into different camps. I have a student right now in the writing lab who loves grammar. Like it just gets him so excited, and he's actually the one who runs our website. So he every day puts like a different grammar joke or cartoon on the website because it's just what he really loves. But then of course I have other students that's not why they're there. That's not why they're tutoring. Like they're happy to help people with grammar, but they might need to pull in a friend because it's not really their area of strength. And I think some of you, like, you're excited about talking about literature, you're excited about talking about the ideas in their writing, but maybe not as excited about like pointing out to them like what a sentence fragment looks like, right? And like how to fix that or something. And so we do kind of struggle with that a little bit. Any other thoughts about these questions about like what your goals are or what you think it might look like when you get into the classroom?
Well, something that I am concerned with is how outside culture affects students' use of language and grammar. Especially, I think today, the use of social media and technology allows certain dialects and slangs to become so, like, they just kind of adopt into everyday language. And I think a lot of students struggle with like academic writing versus what they feel is natural to them.
Yes.
And I don't want to make my students feel like there's academic writing and then natural. I want their academic writing to feel natural
To
that
them.
it is their voice, that they don't fall into like a code switching type dynamic where they feel like their voice has to be altered in the classroom.
That's a really great point. My AP students just finished a unit on language, and so one of their assignments was to write a paper sort of reflecting on the different languages that they use in their lives. And so a lot of them did point out that they felt like there's sort of their academic voice that they save for papers for me. And then depending on who they were, they had a lot of different dialects that they use and a lot of different languages that they use beyond my classroom walls. And that paper was actually really freeing for them because a lot of them could pull in those other voices and dialects. We read like Gloria Anzaldua's How to Tame a Wild Tongue, in which she's bringing in her different Chicana voices to be able to write that essay. And for them to see that, like, you know, there is a grammar to those other dialects that they speak, by the way. So like social media has a grammar, and they are probably much more versed in that grammar than we are. Grammar does run into, you know, a lot of these issues because we'll talk about essay corrections, which is something I do, and I felt really weird giving my students essay corrections for their language essays because that was a place where I wanted them to be really free about their voice, but I also wanted them to communicate their ideas as clearly as possible. So a lot of conflicting ideas that we really have to manage when we're talking about grammar. It could be a confusing thing. But hopefully this will give you some ideas of how I've managed that in my classroom and maybe give you some thoughts about how you might do it in your classroom. So when I first got into what I'm going to be talking to you about, which is mentor sentences, this quote really stood out to me. It said, "Our rallying cry should be texts, not tests." And so I really appreciate that none of you said, I want to teach grammar because I want my students to score well on tests. That said, I kind of like asked myself, what if our students still have to take those tests, and what if they still have to do well on them? I'm at a school where most of my kids are predicted to score in the 99th percentile on the state tests, and I'm still expected to show growth. So that's a really tricky situation for me. And I had administrators coming to me after a testing situation one year and saying to me, your students can't miss anything on the test. They can't miss anything. No questions missed, because if they do, you're not going to be able to show any growth. In fact, you're going to show that you had a negative impact on these students. So you need to show growth, and so they can't miss anything. Furthermore, again, I have these high achieving students. Some of us were talking before class. They have goals of going to MIT. They have goals of going to Harvard. They have goals of going to Vanderbilt. They have these big dreams. So they need to score well on things like the ACT. They need to score well on the PSAT. And if they can't answer those questions, that hurts their chances. If I didn't teach them how to use a comma properly in my English class sophomore year, that can have a significant impact on where they go to college and the scholarship money that they get and all sorts of other things. And so I need my students to do well on tests, but I don't want my class to be about taking tests. So I started to ask myself, is there a way that I can do both? that I can keep my focus on having my students think about how they and others are constructing sentences to communicate effectively and still teach them grammar in the process. And I did not come up with mentor texts. Heather Adkins did. Well, she didn't even necessarily, she's the one who taught them to me. I think they've been around for a while and a lot of people use them in different ways, but I'm going to show you how I use them, which is adapted from how she showed them to me. What I would do is I would have on the overhead some sort of sentence that I have chosen from literature from them. And it's very possible before this goes up on the board that I will have done a little bit of a mini lesson with my students. So at our school, we have Harbrace handbooks. For this particular sentence, I might have asked my students to look up Rule 12C, which is about commas in a series. And so my students would have just kind of looked over that, and we would have kind of gone over like, okay, when you have a series of grammatical elements, then you would have commas in between them. And we would have just kind of reviewed that rule so that my students understand it. But then they would have this sentence. And what I would ask my students, and I'll ask you then, is take a few moments to jot this sentence down and put down anything that you notice about it. All right, so we're going to go to my classroom and see what this looks like with actual students. All right, so let's get to our mentor sentence. For those of you who read Fahrenheit 451, this is going to seem familiar. So the sentence is, and since things really couldn't be hurt, since things felt nothing and things don't scream or whimper, as this woman might begin to scream and cry out, there was nothing to tease your conscience later. So let's just kind of get some background on this sentence. Those of you who read Fahrenheit 451 for summer reading, do you remember like what was going on in this part of the book?
Yeah, is this when they were burning the house of this woman who was storing books, and they just burned her with the house?
Yeah, great. So you remember in this book, it was Montague's job. It's like this futuristic society, right? It's his job to burn books because books are banned. Nobody's supposed to have them. And typically when they show up at a house, the owners have already been like taken away by the police. And so this sentence is dealing with that moment of Montague trying to think about like, oh, now what do I do, right? So let's talk about the things that you guys noticed about this sentence. What are some things that you all noticed?
The adverbial clause came in like a sentence.
Good. So we had adverbial clauses at the beginning of the sentence. Can you give me an example?
And since things really couldn't be hurt, and since things felt nothing, and things don't scream or whimper.
Okay, good. So these are coming at the beginning of the sentence. Other things that you guys notice?
Isn't to scream and to tease infinitives?
To scream. Yeah, very good. So to tease. So we have some infinitives. So remembering way back our infinitive phrases. Thank you for that. Good. What do you notice about those adverbial clauses at the beginning of the sentence?
I felt like it was a lot of commas, so it was like multiple pauses, so it was kind of like too many pauses almost, so it made it like more dramatic, I guess.
Okay, good. So we have a lot of pauses here because there are a lot of commas at the beginning of the sentence. I'm actually going to give you guys the term a periodic sentence. A periodic sentence is when you have to wait to like the very end of the sentence for the main clause. So what an author might do is front load the beginning of the sentence with a lot of subordinate clauses, maybe some phrases, but it's all coming at the beginning of the sentence, and then you have to wait until the end of the sentence for the main idea. So looking at this sentence, Elena's already pointed out, like one of the things it does is create a lot of dramatic pauses. Because what are we worried about at this point in the book?
Since you can hear the woman, it's going to come back and haunt him later on.
Yeah, good. So he's worried about what's going to harm his conscience later on. Books didn't harm his conscience, right? That was fine. But burning a woman in her home, that's the kind of thing that stays with you. So those dramatic pauses are there for a reason, right? They're making us, like Montague, anxious about what is going on in this scene. What else do you guys notice?
the amount of repetition because it said things over and over again at the beginning.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, so we have, and since things, and things, right? A lot of things. What might be the effect of this repetition?
To show like the importance of like they were things, not like people, so like it wouldn't haunt his conscience because they were not real or
not living, yeah, not human, right? So at this point, like books, they're just things for Montauk. They don't mean all that much, right? But this could be a turning point for him because he's not burning a thing any longer. He might be burning a person. One of the things that I haven't heard yet, first of all, is there anything that seems like grammatically like you've been taught not to do or that seems strange about this sentence?
I mean, it starts with the coordinating conjunction.
Oh, that's annoying. My husband was complaining about that one the other day. Like, you can't start sentences with a coordinating conjunction. I said, where does it say that? But that's what he was taught. Have any of you been taught that? Okay, and then here we have Ray Bradbury, one of the most famous authors of the 20th century, telling us that he's going to start a sentence with a coordinating conjunction. It's a strange choice here, and perhaps if we had more context, we could get into the why here. But any thoughts about like why starting the sentence with an and would work here? If you had to guess, what do you think was coming before this sentence?
was it maybe her like refusing to leave?
Yeah, maybe so. Perhaps it was her refusing to leave. Maybe it was more thoughts about like him like being dumbfounded and scared by this whole situation. And so it's connecting to those ideas that came before it. And I think like when you're in kind of a panic state of mind, like there's that tendency to be like, and this, right? Like kind of like when you guys are thinking about your homework and like how much you have to do, and you're like, I have to do this, and I have to do this, and I have to do this, right? So there perhaps is a reason for that and there. Earlier, Brendan was pointing out the adverbial clauses. What are the adverbial clauses in this sentence?
Shop. And since things really couldn't be hurt.
Okay, good. Since things really couldn't be hurt. So what is our subordinate conjunction there? I hear lots of whispers. Since. Okay, good. So since here. All right, what's our second adverbial clause?
Since things felt nothing.
Good. And so it has since, good, also as its subordinating conjunction. What do you notice about the next clause? What is the next clause in the sentence? Meaning it has a subject and a verb.
Independent clause?
Yeah, so Kate says this is an independent clause. So what's going on here? Because is that the main clause of the sentence?
No.
No. What is the main clause of the sentence? We kind of gave that away when we were talking about periodic sentences.
There was nothing to tease your conscience later.
Good, there was nothing to tease your conscience later. So what is going on with the since things felt nothing and things don't scream or whimper? What is he doing there? Yeah.
He could have set everything off by commas and listed all of them in a row, but instead he's setting them off so it makes it more dramatic.
What do you mean, like he's setting them off?
Like, since things can be hurt, things felt nothing, and things don't scream or whimper, he didn't put them all together, he set them off.
Yeah, great. He could have said, and since things couldn't be hurt, felt nothing, and don't scream or whimper, right? We could have just had this as one long clause with multiple verbs, but that's not what he did. So clearly he's trying to separate these up, make you think about each one of them, right? Because things don't do these things, but what does? A human does these things. A human can be hurt. A human feels, right? A human can scream and whimper. And so it's making us notice the difference between those. This is a comparison passage. But also what's going on here is something that we haven't talked about too much, is that inside this adverbial clause, he's created a compound sentence. So the adverbial clause has its own compound here. It's combined with a comma and. We'll get into that when we get into Rule 12a, but some of you have already gotten that on your papers before, right? So he is putting under this one adverbial clause, like sort of combining another clause with it. Do we have any other clauses besides the ones we've talked about and the main independent clause?
Well, I don't know exactly what you put it under, but as this woman might begin to scream and cry out.
Yeah, good. So we have this other clause here that's saying, okay, things don't do these things. Things don't scream or whimper. So what is as this woman might begin to scream and cry out kind of telling us about or comparing it to? Yeah, Kenny?
It's talking about the difference between burning the books rather than burning the woman.
Yeah, good. So books don't scream or whimper, but this woman will scream and cry out. So here we have another adverbial clause. So there are a lot of them in this sentence, right? They're kind of stacking here. He's stacking them all at the beginning of the sentence and waiting for us to get to that thought. Because of course, what is suggested about, like, in those other situations, there was nothing to tease your conscience later. So in this situation, he's comparing about what happens when you burn books versus this particular situation. So what's going to happen to him here? Yeah, Kenny.
I mean, when he burns the books, it doesn't really affect him just because they're things. But if he burns the woman, it's going to stick with him for probably the rest of his life.
Yeah, good. This is gonna stay with him. I also thought, did any of you write down, I thought the word tease was kind of a weird word here. What do you think, like, the word tease suggests? Because I might have chosen bother or upset or something along those lines, but he chooses tease.
To me, it kind of has like a playful connotation almost. Like whenever you talk about tease, like use that with like maybe like children, like they tease each other.
Yeah.
And so like it seems kind of malicious.
Yeah. So teasing is meant to like hurt you. What else about teasing usually happens?
It's very persistent.
Yeah, good. It keeps going. It doesn't stop. So what he's suggesting about this memory is that it's going to continue to bother him. It's malicious. It's trying to hurt him, that it's going to stay with him and not let go, right? Kind of like a bully. So one of the things that you want to think about if you're choosing mentor sentences is choosing one that has a lot that you can work with, that the author has provided you with a lot of great choices that you can dig into. But what else did we talk about in the process?
Why, like language choice of what it does to a text or what it does to a sentence and how it impacts the whole section that you're reading.
Yeah, so we're talking about craft, we're talking about choices, we're talking about a lot of things that can be done with just one little grammar rule. All right, so we're not done though with our mentor sentence. So the next step that I would do with my students is I'd say, okay, now we're going to template this sentence. And how complicated I get about this depends on what we're studying. So early in the year, just to kind of walk you through my process, I try to, again, I have sophomores, so it's not like they've never been taught grammar before, but I want to make sure that we have the same language. And I tell them this, like, it's not so important to me, that you take a quiz and you know that phrase is a gerund. However, what is important to me is when we're having these conversations that we can talk about, like, oh, when the author's using a gerund right here, this is what it's accomplishing. So for us to have the same language when we're talking about a sentence, that's important. So I start with phrases first, and I tell them these are the building blocks, all right? I like to think of a sentence like Legos, all right? So you start with phrases, and then from there you can build clauses. So we go from phrases to clauses, and then I start getting into like grammatical rules, like, comma rules, semicolon rules, colon rules, those kinds of things. So it all starts with the basics. So this is a little bit further in the year when we get to this point. So when I'm talking about clauses, for instance, we might only template the clauses. All right, so let's pull this up just a little bit more and try to template this sentence. All right, so let's mostly just focus on clauses here because that's what we mostly talked about today. So we said we started with?
Adverbial.
Good, an adverbial clause. And then we have a comma, And then what do we have?
Adverbial.
An adverbial clause. But what did we say was going on here? That was kind of weird.
There was an independent clause after it.
Okay, good. So it's got like a comma and like a coordinating conjunction and an independent clause. So this is all sort of one unit of like a compound sentence here, right? All right, then we have our other comma, and we have, what did we say?
Another adverbial.
Good, another adverbial clause. And then finally we have our main independent clause. Okay. There are a few benefits of doing this with my students. One, it kind of reviews what we just said. I like to call on kids who maybe didn't have all the answers the first time around and say like, okay, what did we say this was? And so that they can, you know, make sure that they're with us and I can check on their understanding at that point. The other thing that's really nice about this is it allows us to review things. There might be a sentence later on in the year that has an adverbial clause or has a participial phrase, and they've forgotten what those things were, because it's been a while since we've talked about them. So now it's back, right? And you're gonna have to recognize it again because I brought it back in another sentence, and so now we're talking about it again. So it allows us to do that. And so they're kind of reviewing the grammatical structure here, and they're kind of seeing how sentences can be put together. I do kind of like to use weird sentences because it opens up possibilities for them. They start thinking like, so I can do this? And I've had students say that, like, I could have like a whole bunch of verbs, like if I had a good reason for it. Am I writing? Yeah. Like there are things, you know, it doesn't all have to just be subject, verb, object every single time, right? Like there are other ways that you can create sentences to say what you want to say, right? To get the point across that you want to get across in the best way possible. So we're still not done. The last thing that I like to do with my students is ask them to imitate it. While they would be working, after I'd written my sentence, I pass out little cards of paper as well, and I ask them to rewrite their sentence on that sheet of paper. So they're basically just index cards that I've cut in half. So what I would like you guys to do right now is all I want you to do, you don't have to have the exact same structure that Bradbury has, but I'd like you to try some introductory adverbial clauses. So try to stack at least a couple of them onto the beginning and see how that works out, and save your independent clause for the end. Okay, so take a few moments and try to write your own example of this. Remember, when you finish your sentence, go ahead and put it on the card. If you don't mind your name appearing on it later, put your name on the same side as the sentence. If you do mind, put it on the back. All right. When your group is ready, go ahead and share your clauses or your sentences with each other with your adverbial clauses, and then choose one that you guys want to share with the rest of the class.
Since I was in class, and since I was told to write a sentence, I wrote one about writing a sentence.
Oh, you're taking Sean's side on that.
Yeah.
Right. Mine was, while the sky was filling with colors, we sat on the beach and listened to the waves, and it was as if all our problems fell away. That's it.
All right, does every group have one chosen? Yeah. I wrote two of them this time, but I think I'm going to read my happier one. So since this one wasn't very happy, I'll share a happy sentence. So I said, and because the sky was clear, because there was a crispness in the air and the sun was shining, as if it were inviting us out, we dropped our plans and headed to the park. So.
Though he had not come with us, though he had decided we were better off on our own, we felt his presence, and we knew he was watching whether he was with us or not.
I can't decide if that's comforting or creepy. Which were you going for there? Both? Okay, all right. Thank you. Over here.
Once I figure out a destination and once I scrounge up enough money, I'll be able to fulfill my dreams of traveling the world.
Very nice. So both of these had a couple of adverbial clauses at the beginning. Ethan's even had like a compound sentence at the end, so that was nice. Over here.
As the sun began to set, as the stars began to rise, and I stood there motionless, while the moon began to shine, I thought of just how wonderful the world really is.
That was a sweet one. Yeah, very nice. Over here.
And because he got into Stanford, because he maintained a 4.0, and all of his classes were advanced, as his father's were years ago, he was rewarded with a shiny black Camaro.
Is this like wishful thinking? Yeah, all right, sounds good. Yeah, over here.
Though there was an everlasting amount of anxiety, even though there was a desire for life to end, as if a relationship with anyone or any god would help, he felt the need to form relationships with people and to push through the hard times.
Wow, there's like a whole story in that one. That sounds great. This is normally when I would have my students turn in their cards, and I'd make sure that there weren't any questions at that point. So this is what I do with them afterwards. I create little posters, and I'll put like either what it is that we're studying, so you see like participial phrases up there, or if we're talking about a sentence structure, we'll kind of put the template for that sentence structure. So you see on the one at the bottom, we are talking about colons and how you can use colons to combine independent clauses. And so I just have that small little template of independent clause, colon, independent clause. And there's a little arrow because that second independent clause is kind of referring back to something in the first independent clause. I'll put the mentor sentence first so that they can remember, oh yeah, that was that mentor sentence that we read. And then I put student sentences underneath. And I choose a sentence from each class period to put onto the poster. You know, there's no fanfare about it. It just kind of goes up there. But I kind of like that because the next time they walk into class, they're like, oh, that's my sentence. Right, like, you know, and they don't usually make a big deal out of it, but you can see them noticing. So again, if they didn't want their name on the sentence, I don't put it on there, so they don't have to be totally embarrassed if they, you know, didn't feel 100% positive about that sentence. I do actually, they don't know this, but I do keep track of whose sentences I've put up there. So I do have a sheet of paper where I put like, okay, I've already done Sydney's sentence from first period, so I'm not going to do Sydney's sentence again, even if Sydney writes a beautiful sentence every single week. I'm going to choose somebody else. So that way many students get the opportunity to see their sentences up as examples in the classroom. And for me, this is a way to, you know, slight publication, right? Like it's not a big piece or anything, but they're being used as examples. And I had I'd done a project with my AP students at the beginning of the school year, and I had literally put all of their projects on the wall. So every single group's project was on the wall. But one of my students who I had last year came in, and she was like, "Oh, my project's on the wall." And then she realized, she's like, "Oh, they're all on the wall." But she said, "I got so excited last year when my mentor sentence was on the wall. Like I knew I'd done something right when I saw my mentor sentence up there." And so, you know, these are pretty nerdy kids, but I think any kid, to know that like you've chosen them means a lot, and that their writing is being seen by other people who walk into the room. It's not much, it's just one little sentence. The other thing that I do is I keep all of their cards all year long. So those are up on a table at the front of the room. It's just, they're in a little box, and I just line them up all year long. And sometimes I do author's chair, and so we have times called writer's block where like students are just allowed to write. They can write on what they're working on in my class, or they can work on their author's chair piece or whatever, but they're supposed to be writing during those times. And if they can't think of anything to write, well, there's a whole bunch of cool sentences your classmates wrote. Why don't you pick up some of those and see if they give you an idea? And so they function as great ideas. I had a student who ended up creating an author's chair from all of her mentor sentences. So she looked at all of them and was like, I think I can create a story out of this. Because they really do have some cool thoughts that come out of their brains when they're just being asked to like come up with something. And almost all of them seem story generative. Like they're like the start of a really great story. So the other thing I've used them for is on the midterm. So they have to illustrate to me some of the story strategies that we've been talking about, because I teach narrative the first semester. So on their midterm, I'll say, pull one sentence out of the mentor sentences and craft a short little story around it and do these things with it. And so that's part of their midterm assignment. So I get a lot of mileage out of doing these things. Okay, so let's talk about what this could look like in your class. Sometimes, Morris/McDaniel and I struggle a little bit when we go talk to people, because they're like, well, but your central kids can do it, but what about, my kids? And I really reject that thinking altogether. Anyhow, I feel like good instruction is good instruction, and if it's good enough for my central kids, it's good enough for kids everywhere. Kids deserve good instruction. But this started in elementary school. I'm pretty sure elementary school teachers were the ones who did this first, in first grade. I've had friends who teach ELL, and they say that they do this with their students. So this is not something that's for central kids or for high achieving kids, but it's going to look slightly different depending on what you're focusing on. I told you kind of how I set mine up, but Heather, she teaches at Gallatin High School, and she did it really differently. She does a handout where each day of the week they do part of their mentor sentence. So I do the whole thing all at once, and it takes us a good 30 minutes. I do it on a block day, so we have an hour and a half. She breaks it up throughout the whole week because that's what works best for her. So on Monday they just notice. And they take notes, and it's on a handout. And then on Tuesday, they template. On Wednesday, they actually revise the sentence. So they say, how could you say the same thing with a different grammatical structure? Sometimes students think well, there's only one way to say this. No, there are myriad ways, right? And so let's try something else out. On Thursday, they do the imitation. And on Friday, she does a quick quiz over everything that they've been doing that week, and so the skill that was in the mentor sentence is also on that quiz. So then she can kind of check in with them and make sure that they've learned it. So that's how she does it, and so there are a lot of different ways you could do it. Again, I use the hard brace, but that doesn't mean that that's what you would have to do. You might have a grammar textbook, or you might not even want to use a grammar textbook at all. I have some colleagues who have decided that, sure, we're going to do the hard brace stuff, but we're actually going to skip the stuff that's just about sentence structure, and we're going to get into the effective sentences part. So we're going to talk about parallelism and unity and ideas and those kinds of things, and that's the kind of stuff we're going to focus on this year. So there's a lot of possibilities. I know in elementary schools they start with just we're working on nouns, right? And so that's all they're going to focus on with their mentor sentence when they're creating them. They're going to be very small and simple, but hopefully still something that they can think about. And again, my goal with this is that my students are not just doing a bunch of worksheets. They're really thinking about writing, and I really want them to think about grammar as a choice. And sometimes we do sentences that break grammar rules. So one of my sentences comes from Huck Finn. And so Huck makes up words. And so one of the things that he says is lazying around. And so we start talking about lazying isn't a real word. I mean, it is for Huck, but it's not a real word. But what he's done is that's a participial. And participles, of course, come from verbs, right? So the verb that he's created here is to lazy. So for a Huck, you can lazy. That is something that you can do. And so my students have a lot of fun with that one because we actually work on coming up with our own fake words that we want to create, our own fake participial phrases when they do that. And so, I like to say I can't sport, and my kids get that, okay, Miss Esberger isn't good at sports, but this is kind of a joke, of course. Any thoughts about how you could incorporate something like this in your classroom? Would your kids that you're working with right now, could they benefit from something like this?
I think with a lot of the kids that I'm with currently, I would probably use Heather's way of doing it more so, just because that breaks it down for them and that helps them think through it in parts instead of kind of doing it all at once. So I would probably use that method with them.
Yeah, Yeah, I think that's great. Breaking it down, that way you don't have to spend too much of a single class period. I think at her school they didn't have block days, so every class period was only like 45 minutes. So you don't want to spend, 30 minutes doing this because that's a good portion of your class. So, a little bit each day, and then your students aren't overwhelmed either with what you're trying to do. For a lot of my kids, this stuff is review for them. So I'm really trying to like push them to the next level. And I do voice lessons with my AP students, so that kind of is a nice transition from doing mentor sentences sophomore year. Yeah, any other thoughts about like what this could look like with the kinds of students you've worked with so far, or what you might do differently?
This definitely has a different aspect to it. A lot of the students I'm working with right now in our 8th grade class are doing problems out of a grammar book, and I'm like, I like grammar. Yeah. I was good at grammar. Other kids aren't, and they're having trouble with verbals. Yeah. And like, this is a different way of teaching it other than saying, okay, do problems 1 through 30. Versus let me just break it down in a different way than what is constantly in front of you.
Yeah, and here's the thing that I noticed, and part of the reason I wanted to start doing this is I felt like my students could do grammar in, like as you all said, in isolation. They could answer questions on a test if they knew that that's what the test was about. They can answer questions on the ACT about it. But then they'd make those same mistakes in their own writing. And I thought that was infuriating and frustrating because I thought, okay, I just gave you a quiz over like commas with coordinating conjunctions, combining 2 independent clauses, and you aced it. You got every single one right. And then you have 10 of those mistakes in your paper. Like, what is going on? Why isn't this carrying over into your own writing? And because it had nothing to do with their writing. when they're doing just a bunch of handouts and worksheets, like that has nothing to do with their own writing. They do not see the connection. So this, one, they're studying it in someone else's writing. So it gives them sort of something to aspire to, because you're saying like, you can write like William Golding, right? You can write like Mark Twain. You can write like Zora Neale Hurston, right? You can write like Martin Luther King. Like these are the kinds of people that I bring in, and the sentences are beautiful or expertly crafted, and you can do it too. But the other thing is then they are actually doing it with their own writing. So they're seeing their own words, their own thoughts and ideas, and they're thinking about why they're doing it when they're creating these sentences. So it gets them to think about these things a little bit more. And I'm not saying that this would necessarily be the only grammar instruction you would do. I'm going to show you one more thing that I do with my students, but I've gotten a lot of mileage out of this. And again, I think I want my students thinking on that higher level, thinking about the whys of their language. And I want them to see grammar as useful to them as writers. And so this is a way for me to do it. You see on here too that there's, okay, I did things the hard way. I went out and found every single sentence myself and like flipping through books and, you don't have to do that. There's actually a website where it's called greatsentences.blogspot.com, and like they literally have like different grammar issues and then like sentences that they suggest. So there's also a Great Sentences blog. There's a couple of different things out there that you can use, so you don't have to come up with your own. Yeah.
Do you think this would work if you took like the student sentences and let them compare each other's, like to where, say I got his and I kind of tried to break it down and figured that out, like at what he used as far as verbs, prepositional phrases, and all that?
I think that would be great. So you could either do it with the mentor sentences like that they're writing currently in class, or one of the things that I sometimes do is ask students, like after we've finished a publication, we have author's chair, but sometimes I'll say like, read like your best sentence in the paper that you just turned in. And like, that would be a great time to like, you thought that was your best sentence. So go ahead and give it to someone else and see like if they can figure out what you were doing in that sentence. Let you be the author there, that like, for once they're picking apart. Because, of course, they love to push back at the idea that authors do things intentionally and like that they make choices and stuff. And so like, well, you can be the author, and like someone can look at the choices that you made when you constructed that sentence. And you might be surprised by your own genius, right, in the process. I think that's an excellent idea. Now I'm gonna go back to my class and do that. So yeah, I love that idea. Just some of the benefits that I noticed about it in doing the mentor sentences. I did notice that my students would like try out structures that we had used in class, and that they try them out in author's chair too, so that was kind of fun. And then I have them do revisions, which is what we're getting into next. So this is a student who had to revise a sentence. So his original sentence, having to navigate around these clusters while trying to cross the school to lockers and other classrooms becomes quite challenging. He revised that sentence to navigating these clusters, attempting to cross the school, maneuvering from lockers to classrooms, and only having 5 minutes to do it in becomes quite challenging. And his rationale for that revision of the sentence was the repetition of tasks makes the situation seem more difficult to manage, supporting my claim of it being a challenge. So I have them think about like, okay, if you are going to change that sentence, why are you changing that sentence? So that kind of gets into the other thing that I do. I was teaching standard junior English at Smyrna High School at the time, and I still use these. So this is definitely not something that is just for AP students. So we have turned it in at Central, so my students submit a lot of their papers online, which is great. And again, because I use the hard brace, I mark grammar mistakes with just hard brace rules online. And so I put those all on the left-hand margin, and I put my other comments on the right-hand side or within the text so that they know exactly where those sort of grammatical and stylistic and structural comments are going to be. And they're already labeled. So you can see, like, you know, I've got 15A, 6A on the student's paper. 15A means that there's a problem with an apostrophe in that section, and 6A is subject-verb agreement issues. So I put it on the line that it takes place in. So when I first started commenting on papers, I would fix the mistakes for them. I would go through and I would like do like those little editing marks of like, here's an arrow, add a comma, right? Or like cross this out or whatever. And all that did was make me really good at editing. Like it did not help them in the least bit. And I was putting way too much thought and effort into like, you know, fixing their grammatical errors for them. And so when I learned to do this, I was like, oh, this is so much better. So I just tell them what the issue is and that it's somewhere in that line. Okay, so one, that means they've got to like look it up. And two, they have to figure out where that error is and also how to fix it. So to be able to do essay corrections, you're going to need some sort of consistent way of referring to grammatical errors. So for me, obviously the hard brace works because it labels every single one of them for you, but it doesn't have to be that. Like, I mean, if you, like, I use SP for spelling because that's not a hard brace rule. So you could, every time there's a spelling mistake, you could put SP. You could write frag for fragment, right? Like, it doesn't have to be those things. You just need a way for your students to know what it is that you're talking about. And like, I know teachers that just give them a handout at the beginning of the year that has everything on it, and like, that'll be fine. You can use whatever it is that you want to do. So again, I'm labeling the errors, but I'm not fixing them for them. The other thing I like about this is that it's differentiated. So I'll have a student who has one grammatical error in his whole paper. And you know what? That student only has to fix one grammatical error, because that student did a good job editing. So he's going to be rewarded for that, and he shouldn't be punished and have to do like, you know, a whole bunch of worksheets about something he already knows how to do and has demonstrated to me that he knows how to do. I'll have another student, and I have had them, who has 26 errors in her paper. And almost, you know, 90% of them are 12A. Now we've identified a weakness for that student. We have identified that you have never learned this rule. It's never been internalized for you. Sure, you've been taught it and you've probably done a bunch of handouts on it, but it's never become a part of your writing practice. So now you are aware of that, because you're going to have to keep writing 12A, 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 and fixing it a whole bunch of times, and you have 26 errors to fix for your paper. It can be focused too, like for this last paper with my sophomores, I haven't talked to them about MLA citations yet. And so I told them, like, sure, you can go to the writing lab and get a little bit of help, and I'm expecting you to do a little bit of it right, but I'm not going to like pick it apart because we're going to talk about that before the next paper. So I didn't mark that on this last paper because they weren't ready for it, and there's other stuff I wanted them to do. So it might be that, like, depending on your student population, you tell them, all I'm going to mark for this paper is like subject-verb agreement and fragments and comma splices. That's it. That's what I'm looking for in this paper because that's what we've been talking about, and that's what I want to make sure that you know how to do. So you can kind of zero in. So again, I'm rewarding the students who are editing well, and they learn pretty quickly that they should edit well because this can get a little tedious. And so before the next paper, they're like, I don't think I want to do 26 essay corrections next time. I'm going to take a little extra time to edit this paper. I might go to the writing lab and get some help. I might run it by Miss Esberger and talk to her about it. And just, they'll put a little bit more effort into it the second time around. And this emphasizes the difference between editing and revision because for this assignment, like, this is just editing, and everyone has to do this. Now, there are kids who have 0 mistakes, so there's one little thing that I asked them to do because, like, everybody could do a little bit better, right? But they have very little work to do if they had 0 mistakes. But that doesn't mean they got a good grade on their paper. So it might be grammatically just the most beautiful paper in the entire world, and they still got a C on it, right? So that clues them into that grammar isn't everything. It's part of their grade. It matters, but it certainly isn't everything. I pretty much always allow rewrites on my papers. You could do something like this too. Since we have the writing lab, I require a trip to the writing lab if they're going to revise. So if you're going to turn in another draft to me, I want to see that you're seeking help. But you could require that they conference with you or that they do a peer session with somebody else. Like, just that they're getting some extra feedback besides what I gave them. So the revision is a completely separate thing, though. It has nothing to do with the essay corrections. Like, sure, they should fix those grammatical things in the revision, but I'm looking for a lot more than just fixing your grammar. So that kind of emphasizes to them that those are 2 different skills. That on the essay corrections, we're just talking about editing. On the rewrite, like, you need to do it all. And because if you had 0 grammar mistakes and you got a C, clearly there's something else going on in your paper that needs attention. So let me show you what this looks like. It basically says paragraph number and sentence number. So my students will go through their paper, and so, like, let's say the first mistake is in the 3rd paragraph. They'll write paragraph 3, sentence 2. That way they don't have to count all their sentences out. But this allows me to be able to go back and make sure that, like, we're looking at the same error when I'm grading these later on. And then they have to put the type of mistake it was. So they'll put 12A, 12B. They can write SP for spelling, but whatever the kind of error was goes in that 3rd column. And then that 4th column is their wording for what the rule is. So again, if you were doing this and you didn't have a hard brace, you might have a handout where they could look this stuff up, or some sort of resource for them that they could find what the rule was. And probably not you, because you don't want them all coming to you at the same time asking you for what the rule is. So a colleague of mine and I do this differently. She has them write the rule every single time. So if they have like 20 12As, they need to write the rule 20 times. I don't have them do that. I feel like that's busy work for them, and I'm like punishing them or something. So instead, they only have to write the rule once. So anytime they have a new error, they write the rule for that error and they put it into their own words. Because I want to see, like, how they're interpreting it, because sometimes they didn't get it. Like, I'll look at, like, what they said was that rule, and I'm like, that's not it. And so that's a clue for me that I need to go back and talk to that person about what's going on. And then they have to fix the error. And so they write their correction on the sheet. And I do make them do every single one of those. My reasoning for that is if you do have 20 12As, that is not something you've internalized. You do not see that as like something that you're supposed to do in writing yet. So if you fix it that many times, hopefully it'll start to sink in. And this is different, I think, than a grammar worksheet, because this is their own writing. These are mistakes that they have made in their own writing. These are their sentences, which are always more complicated than anything that you're going to see on a handout anywhere. And so they are dealing with those issues that they have created. So I have them put those in that final column. And then down at the bottom, and this kind of ties back to the mentor sentences, is having them revise a sentence. So even a kid who has 0 mistakes and got 100 on their essay still has to do this assignment. For some of my kids, it's obvious because I've pointed out to them. I'm like, the wording doesn't make any sense here. I have no idea what you're trying to say. Or a big one lately has just been vague word choice. You know, like my sophomores wrote about how they interpret literature. And so a lot of them were saying things like, symbolisms can mean lots of things to like lots of different people in lots of different situations. And like, you know, it's just the sentence like said nothing. And so in those cases, I would say like, that's a great sentence for you to revise, right? And so some of them, like, it's just their personal choice. Maybe it was a really well-written essay, and so they're gonna kind of evaluate their own weaknesses in those situations. So they write the original sentence, they write their revision, what they think is a little bit better, and they write their rationale. Like, why did I make that change? Why is this a better sentence than my last one? So even if they choose not to rewrite their whole essay, I'm still sort of forcing them to go back and think about their writing and how it could be just a little bit better. But they can also pull in those skills that they're learning from those mentor sentences. I'm giving them the tools in those mentor sentences to be able to create revisions. And again, you know, like, this is maybe the closest I get to giving grammar handouts to my students. But I found that this is really effective. And again, it's because it's their own writing. It's not isolated, right? Like, this is not somebody else's sentence somewhere that they're working with. They're working with their own complicated sentences and reflecting on the success of those.